I promise my description of it was better than the book itself, and you don't need to read it. No one's reading that series for the plot. There is no plot. I had to suffer through America Singer the Singer so that you don't have to. Just read this. I promise you'll have a much better time. Hello everyone, welcome. So today I am filming a video that has been requested by a couple of you and also an idea I've had for some time, and it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time now because I love making recommendation videos, but I thought this specific type of recommendation would be particularly beneficial for you all because, as you all know, I love to talk about books I hate as much as I love to talk about books I love. But a lot of the time when I read a book that I really don't like, I want to find a recommendation that I can give you that's a better version of that book. I'm always comparing it in my head to other books that I've read that I think might be better options for you because yes, while I do love being a hater, I also do want people to enjoy what they read, and I do love to give recommendations of books I love as well. So today I'm going to be giving you book recommendations based off of books I hated. So I think you'll get the perfect combination of everything that the A Clockwork Reader YouTube channel is about. Ranting about terrible books and recommending wonderful ones, all in one video. I had to do some research and do some deep digging for this video, go back in some of my other videos and see if I've mentioned book comparisons before just so I could compile this list fully. So I was studious and I did my research, hence the glasses that I'm wearing today. I thought it would fit the vibe, but also because today's video is sponsored by Peepers. Peepers is a glasses company that provides both readers and polarized sunglasses. I'm currently wearing a pair of their readers, but if you all know me, you know that I don't actually wear like prescription glasses, but these are in fact blue light glasses, which I really love since I am the type of person who is always on my computer since I have to be for work. I really enjoy using blue light glasses because it helps to filter out the blue light and helps prevent eye strain. And Peepers glasses filter up to 40% of visible blue light. I'm also very prone to headaches and I have been wearing these all week while I have been working, and it really makes a big difference for me when I wear them. They're also extremely comfortable because they are super lightweight, so I can barely tell that they're even on my face, and they have spring hinges so they fit very comfortably on your head. The pair I'm currently wearing is the style Rumor, and these are definitely a favorite of mine, but I also got a couple of other styles. So we have this one with the tortoise shell. The design is called Scout, I believe, and I really like the color of these. Again, super lightweight and really comfy. And then I also got a pair of the polarized sunglasses, which are super cute. They have like gold rims. We're gonna put the black ones back on because I think they fit my outfit the best today. They also have a perfect pair finder on their website and a virtual try-on, so you can use your webcam or your phone camera to virtually try on any pair of glasses to see if they're a good fit for you. So if you're interested in trying out Peepers for yourself, you can use my code Clockwork, and the first 100 people to use my link in the description box will get 10% off their first order. Again, thank you to Peepers for sponsoring today's video. Another quick thing before we get into the recommendations, I do want to remind you all that my new journal, the A Clockwork Reader Film and TV Journal, will be released on June 27th, and it is available for pre-order right now. The link is in my description box if you would like to pre-order it from Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and other booksellers. I just realized the belly band wasn't on it, but I'm very excited about this, and I hope you're all excited too. So again, if you'd like to pre-order, the link is in my description box and it will be out on June 27th. All right, so now without any further ado, let's get into all of my recommendations based on books I hated. So like I mentioned earlier, several of you had asked me to make this video, and it was already an idea that I was planning on making anyway, so I'm sure that many of you will be able to guess some of these comparisons, some of these recommendations, but I just wanted to consolidate all of my recommendations into one place because I know I sporadically will talk about how I think this book is just a better version of this book, but I wanted to put them all in one place so you can just have this one space to reference if you're ever looking for a comparison that I've mentioned before. So yeah, let's just dive into it. Okay, so starting off strong, we have to go with the book that kind of really pushed me to fully make this video. I'd mentioned some other ones before, but this was what really pushed me over the edge because I read this book and I was like, absolutely not. It's horrendous and I hate it, and also I know the exact book that it's trying to be and it never could be. But that book is Verity by Colleen Hoover. If you've watched my video reading 5 Colleen Hoover books so that you never have to, you know how I feel about Verity. This book is supposed to be kind of an erotic thriller about this author who ends up becoming the ghostwriter for another famous author, and she moves into her house, and the author that she is ghostwriting for, whose name is Verity and whose house she is living in, is currently in like a comatose state, essentially. I think she's technically awake, but she got into a terrible car accident and she's been bedridden since. And so her publisher asks our main character to become become her ghostwriter. So like I mentioned, she moves into Verity's house with Verity's husband living there. Some mysterious things start to happen along the way, and our main character, whose name is Lowen, I believe, starts to suspect that Verity might be behind some of the mysterious things going on. If any of that sounded interesting to you, I promise my description of it was better than the book itself, and you don't need to read it. But if you have already unfortunately read this book, and there were aspects of it that you liked, like you thought that some of the mystery was a little bit interesting, I have a book that you need to read that is exactly this book, because I fully believe this book is based off of it, and it is infinitely better, and it doesn't have any of the cringy, awful smut that I don't even want to call smut because it was horrifying. And so that is, of course, Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Read this. Don't read this one. If you don't know what Rebecca is about, it follows our main protagonist, who is very young. I believe she's only like 20 or so at the beginning of the book, and she doesn't have a name, so our main character has no name. And she meets this older man who is extremely charming, and she becomes kind of infatuated with him, and very quickly they develop a relationship and they end up getting married, like very, very fast. And she ends up moving in with him into his house, and then she quickly realizes that she doesn't actually know anything about this man, and she starts to find out some more bits and pieces of information about him, and she eventually learns that he previously had a wife who passed away, whose name was Rebecca, and now she feels like she's being haunted by the ghost of Rebecca, both literally and metaphorically. And I'm sure already you can draw so many comparisons, but let's just start with the titles alone. Verity is named Verity after the author, who our main character is in many ways being haunted by, and Rebecca is the name of the wife who, once again, our main character is being haunted by. The comparisons do not stop there. The dynamic between the current wife and the jealousy and mixed emotions she has about the former wife and the husband is exactly the same dynamic that's going on in the story of Verity. There's a scene with like a boat, canoe in both of these books that is uncanny and incredibly similar. The real and true difference is that this is a well-written book and a well-told story, and this is just a really poorly done adaptation of this, if you will. This book has layers and layers of nuance, extremely well-written, complex characters. Our narrator is unreliable. In fact, all the characters are pretty much unreliable, which could very much be said about Verity as well. It's just not well executed. So yeah, my number one recommendation, if you are thinking about reading that book, don't waste your time. I promise you can thank me later. Read this instead. You will have a much better time and you will come away having read a fantastic classic novel. Okay, so the next book that I hated, that I have a better recommendation for, is The Viscount Who Loved Me by Julia Quinn. This is the second Bridgerton novel. I've talked about this a couple of times now, but I'm a huge fan of the Bridgerton TV show, specifically season 2. I love season 2 of that show. I think it's fantastic. So I read this book after I watched that because I wanted more of that story, and I quickly realized that it is nothing like the show, and I despised the book. The characters felt really dull and lackluster to me. The romance was not nearly as interesting as it was in the show, and there were just so many cringy and questionable moments throughout it that I just couldn't even believe that they'd adapted that based off of this novel. So then I was on the hunt for some other historical romance books that I felt like would give me good Bridgerton vibes and would be better than actual Bridgerton, and I did find one. And I've talked about this book before, and I still think more people need to read it, and that book is A Lady for a Duke by Alexis Hall. I say this every time I talk about this book. Don't let the ugly cover fool you. This book is so good. This is a historical romance novel that features a trans main character and is also in a lot of ways inspired by Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. This book is steamy and romantic. The depictions of both like romantic and platonic love in this are so heartwarming. It was just such a sweet book in so many ways, and it definitely made me feel a lot of the same feelings I felt while I was watching the Bridgerton show. This was the kind of story I was expecting when I decided to read The Viscount Who Loves Me, but that didn't deliver anything that I was looking for, but this book absolutely did. If you enjoy historical romance at all, I implore you to try this one out. I still think that this is such an underrated book. I never see anyone talking about it, and I really think people should, especially with romance being so popular. Like, I want this one to be more popular because I think it was such a good story. It was so well written and just so wholeheartedly sweet. So yeah, absolutely my recommendation. Skip out out on the Bridgerton novels. I've even heard that The Viscount Who Loved Me is one of the better ones. So if that's one of the better ones, I don't even want to know what the other ones are like. So skip out on those and definitely give this one a chance. Okay, so the next recommendation I have is based off of a book I read in the I read 5 books I said I'd never read video. And I think I've mentioned this comparison even in that video, but the book is The Selection by Kira Cass. I had to suffer through America Singer the Singer so that you don't have to. So I'm gonna give you a recommendation for something that I think will give you a lot of the same feelings that you might get while reading The Selection. We have a kingdom with royalty and a prince, his romance with someone who is a commoner. The main character also still has red hair, so physically there are also similarities between these characters. But overall, if you want a good story with royals and princes and princesses, I definitely think that you should skip out on The Selection because those books are so underdeveloped, the characters are so bland and boring, and the naming of everything is just so deeply questionable. America Singer, Maxon Screeve, and Swendway, need I say more? But let's say you read this as a kid and you really liked it at that time and you want something that's kind of in the same vein but is actually good. Snow White with the Red Hair. This is a manga series and it also has an anime adaptation. I have technically only watched the anime adaptation, but I know the first, I want to say like maybe 10 or so volumes. I could be wrong about that, but at least a good number of the first few volumes are pretty much exactly the same story as in the show, so I feel pretty comfortable and confident recommending the manga to you since the story is exactly the same. If you also want to watch something, you can just watch the anime instead of reading this too, but if you're in the mood to read something, the manga is the way to go. Snow White with the Red Hair follows the story of our main character, Shirayuki, who is an herbalist who has to flee her kingdom because she is trying to flee the prince of her kingdom who wants to marry her, or he wants her as like a mistress or something, and so she decides to flee her kingdom. And while she's fleeing her kingdom, she runs into the prince of a neighboring kingdom, and she ends up moving to that kingdom and then eventually tries to become a court herbalist at the royal palace. And so there's so much cute romance in this. It's one of my favorite romance anime. It's so wholesome. It is so good. And it's also filled with fantastic characters. We have like a whole group of characters that you grow to love. Really well written dynamics between all of them. Good world building as well. And beautiful artwork too. So highly recommend checking this out or watching the show. You cannot go wrong. It's so fantastic. There are so many moments that just give me butterflies in my stomach. Like the romance is that good. And I feel like that's one of the things that people like about The Selection. Like you're reading for the romance mostly. Like no one's reading that series for the plot. There is no plot. But this one has a fantastic plot, but it has an even better romance. I think it's definitely underrated and absolutely deserves more hype. All right, next recommendation is one I believe I've also mentioned before, and this one actually goes hand in hand with 2 books that I hated. So we're going to talk about 2 different books that I hated, and then I have one recommendation for you. If you've read either of these or you've been thinking about reading either of these, I think this book will be a better option for you. So the first one is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I think you all know where this is going. And the second book is Slammed by Colleen Hoover. You might be thinking, what do these 2 books have in common? Mostly nothing other than they're both horrible in my opinion, but horrible in different ways. Starting with A Little Life, this is a trauma plot book, as most of you already know, but it's a book that I personally believe sensationalizes the trauma that is in it and exploits a lot of that trauma. I think it's a book that was not written for people who have experienced the things that are in it. I think it's a book written for people who haven't experienced any of those things and just want to witness it secondhand. I feel like that book was not written from a place of empathy. I've said this before, but I feel like that book was written irresponsibly, and it's talked about irresponsibly because it's not a book that, like I mentioned, was written for the people that the story is about, and you can feel that while you're reading it, or at least I could, and I just found it extremely manipulative. Slammed by Colleen Hoover, on the other hand, is a book about a teacher-student relationship, about this girl in high school who starts dating her teacher. This is a book that's just completely and utterly romanticizing that relationship, which I think, or at least I would hope, most people find inherently awful. And so the recommendation I have for you, and I feel like most of you will absolutely know what I'm about to recommend, is of course My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. First, in comparison to A Little Life, this is a book that is another trauma plot book, but it's a book that I feel is written from a place of empathy and a place of understanding. This book was clearly written by somebody who understands the pain and experience of the main character they're writing about, and is not writing about it in order to sensationalize the violence that the main character experiences, but rather to just show what that experience is like and show the nuances of it. It's extremely dark and really difficult to read in a lot of ways that A Little Life was really difficult to read, but this book didn't leave me feeling hopeless and like nothing mattered in the world anymore, even though it doesn't really have a happy ending. I would never call it a happy ending. The book doesn't make you feel like the author did not talk to a single person who'd experienced anything that she was writing about, whereas with A Little Life, I know that to be true because the author said that in an interview, and so this book just feels entirely different to me for that reason. The reason I recommend it in place of Slammed, if you read that or you're thinking about reading that, is because this book is literally about a teacher-student relationship and all of the trauma and the pain and how harmful a relationship dynamic like that can be on a person over the span of a long time. So this book basically to me picks up where Slammed left off in a lot of ways. Obviously, if you've read both of these, you know the dynamic is very different. The age gap is significantly larger. In this one, it's like over 20 years, and in that book, they're like 3 or 4 years apart technically, but I don't really care how big the age gap is. Still a teacher, still a student, like it's still completely messed up. So yeah, I would never recommend either of those books to anyone, but this book, despite how difficult it was to read, despite how much I hated reading it a lot of the time and how angry and upset and hurt it made me feel, I still think it's a fantastic book, and it does everything that A Little Life does wrong right. And I think it also shows you everything that's wrong with a book like Slammed. So yes, I've talked about this book countless times since I've read it now, because despite the fact that it's been a while, I truly don't think I'll ever be able to stop thinking about it. Okay, the next recommendation I have is based off of a book I read, I think in my 5 sad books video that I mentioned, but that book is Normal People by Sally Rooney. Of all the books on this list, I don't think I really hate this book. I just don't really like it very much. And I can see what other people might see in it, but personally it just doesn't really work for me. And I think there are other books that do what this book is trying to do more successfully. So I don't hate it like I do with a lot of these other books. I just don't really like it. But the recommendation I have for this one is one I've mentioned before as well, and that is the manga 5 centimeters per second. A lot of the story of Normal People is obviously about these two people who come into each other's lives and come in and out of each other's lives for years and years. And it's about how their relationship with each other and their relationships with other people have shaped them throughout time, and how sometimes there is that one person that you just always go back to despite knowing that it's not going to work and hoping that it might this time around. So it explores a lot of those intricacies. Obviously, it also comments a lot on class, as that's a common theme that Sally Rooney writes about in her books. But 5 centimeters per second, in terms of the emotional dynamic between the characters, for some reason, this worked a lot better for me than Normal People did. Because a lot of this story is essentially the same thing. We follow around our 2 main characters who meet when they're very young, and then eventually one of them has to move away, and then they write letters to each other, and then we get to see the relationships they each have with other people throughout their lives, and then what happens when they come back together. So it follows a lot of the same kind of beats as Normal People does. But for me, this book had so much more depth and emotion, and maybe it's just the writing, maybe it's the fact that it's a manga and there's the images in it as well, but something about this just made me feel, I think, the way that everyone else seems to feel when they say that they love Normal People. So if you really love that book, I think you should definitely give this a try. I think you might actually end up really liking it. For me, in Normal People, it has always just felt like something's missing from that story, and I can't really place my finger on it. I feel like I'm always waiting for it to go there, to go as deep as I'm expecting it to, and then it just never really does. So something about it just feels a little bit shallow. But this book for me actually went where I wanted Normal People to go in terms of the emotional depth of the story. I'm not gonna lie to you, the ending is upsetting. It will probably infuriate you. It infuriated me, but I still loved it. I think similarly to Normal People, it's not a book that's really gonna leave you feeling happy overall. You're gonna feel a lot of mixed emotions, I think. You're gonna feel conflicted about how you feel about these people and the decisions that they're making. Again, very similar to that book, but overall it was ultimately satisfying to read, and it gave me everything that I was looking for in that book. Again, I don't hate Normal People, I just don't really care for it that much, but if you did like it, or even if you you didn't and you want something kind of similar, absolutely would recommend trying out 5 centimeters per second. I know this also has a movie adaptation, but for now I've only read the manga and would definitely recommend you read it too. Okay, the next book we have to talk about was my least favorite book of 2022, and that is of course From Blood and Ash by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I've absolutely talked about this comparison before because as I was reading this book, I remember instantly thinking this, like, if you're liking this, please just do yourself a service and read my recommendation instead, because you don't need any of this. You just don't. Like, I understand that a lot of people are probably reading this because it's smutty, which is fine. Like, I don't care about that. I mean, other than the fact that the smut in this book wasn't even good. But if you're reading it because you want like a smutty romance, that's not where my recommendation is coming from. I'm sure you can find much better smutty fantasy romance, but my recommendation is coming from just like the dynamics that are going on in this story, because so many things about this were exactly the same thing as one of my all-time favorite series, but I feel like nobody makes this comparison because I don't think the same groups of people are typically reading these two things. But to me, it's just so obvious, and this is so clearly the superior choice. And that is, of course, Yona of the Dawn. This is another manga series that has an anime adaptation. I have watched the anime, but I've also read like over 30 volumes of the manga. There's like 40 volumes or something out now. It's very long, there's a lot to it, but I love both with my whole heart and soul. And the manga series, oh my god, one of my favorite fantasy series of all time now. Romance fantasy specifically. So no, it's not smutty like From Blood and Ash. So again, if you're reading for that purpose, maybe I can find you some other recommendation a different time. But if you want the dynamics of that story, if you want a princess character with red hair and her bodyguard who has to take care of her, whose pet name / nickname for her is Princess, just read this. I promise you'll have a much better time, because at the very least, it's well written. From Blood and Ash is a fantasy series that takes place in a different world from ours entirely, but this one is kind of a historical fantasy series that mixes different components of East Asian mythology and history and kind of puts them into this one world. It's definitely fictitious, but it takes elements from real life as well. And we follow our main character, Yona, who is a princess, and one day she has to flee her kingdom with the help of her bodyguard, and she ends up learning along the way that there's a lot she actually doesn't know about what's going on in her kingdom and the people who are around her. She feels betrayed, and she might have this power that she never even knew about in the first place. And does that sound at all similar to From Blood and Ash to you? Because it does to me. I hate to compare the two because this was just utter hot garbage, but like plot-wise, if we can even pretend that From Blood and Ash has any semblance of a plot, it is pretty similar. I promise if you liked any of those elements of that, just read this. Just read this, you'll have a great time. No, it's not smutty, but it's still fantastic. Okay, and lastly, my final recommendation based on a book that I did not like. This is a book that I thought about for a while because I knew I wanted to include it in this video because I knew that I'd had to have some recommendation based off of this because it's just one of the most popular books right now, and having read it, I feel like I need to give people something they can read instead. And this is what I think you should read instead of a book I despised, which is It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover. You all know about it, I've talked about it countless times, everyone's talked about it. But this is a book about domestic violence. There's no way around it. That's the only thing that this book is about. And so my recommendation to you, if you want to read a book about domestic violence, read Carmen Maria Machado's memoir, In the Dream House. This book, it's as painful as reading a lot of what happens in It Ends With Us, except it's actually real and it's not romanticized. Carmen Maria Machado is one of my all-time favorite authors. She's the author of Her Body and Other Parties, which is a short story collection that I absolutely loved when I first read it, and I still think about that book all the time. And I read her memoir, I want to say in 2021 or 2020, and I fell in love with this. This is such a fantastic nonfiction book. As someone who doesn't even read that much nonfiction, I really like finding nonfiction that is told in a very unique format or kind of like feels like fiction. And this book, despite being nonfiction, feels like reading a fiction book because it's just that beautifully written. Despite the subject matter and despite how difficult it is to read, it's still woven together like a novel. This book is extremely hard to read and it's graphic at times. It doesn't spare you the details and it's gut-wrenching. It hurts. And I feel like if you're okay with reading It Ends With Us and you want to read a book about a person in a very horrible relationship who is trying their best to deal with the complicated emotions and everything that comes with experiencing that violence, then I feel like this is the perfect thing for you, because you don't need to waste your time reading this fictionalized version of someone's horrible experiences that romanticizes the violence in it, when you could rather just read someone's actual experiences from a first-hand perspective where the violence is not in any way romanticized. It is depicted as what it is, as it should be. This is easily one of my favorite nonfiction books I've ever read, and just one of my favorite books I've ever read. Anything she writes is phenomenal. Anything she writes, I will read it. So my recommendation, don't waste your time on the manipulation you'll experience reading It Ends With Us, and read In the Dream House instead. But there you all have it. That is it for my list of books that I recommend based off of books I hated. I hope you all enjoyed watching this video, and I hope these recommendations were somewhat helpful to you. If you've read any of the books that I mentioned in this video, whether it be the ones that I did not like or the ones that I'd recommend based off of them, please let me know. Let me know any of your thoughts on them. And if you have any specific recommendations based off of books either you hated or I hated that you think are just better versions of those bad books, please let me know as well. I'm very curious to know what your thoughts are. Again, a huge thank you to Peepers for sponsoring today's video, and be sure to check the link and code in my description box below. If you'd like to follow me on any of my social media, all of my links are in the description box as always. But thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!